Sorry, I'm like choking on my spit right now.
Yeah.
He's so excited.
Or maybe I just wrote too long-winded a bio.
Yo, what's up, everyone? My name is Emilio, and this is a very special Let's Roll Characters interlude. In addition to my friend Christian, we have a special guest joining us, Eugene Marshall. Hey, Eugene. We've got a big announcement. We are super excited that we're going to be adopting a modified character creation system. So, Christian, why don't you give us the scoop on our guest and the new system?
Yeah, well, Amelia, we have, as you said, Dr. Eugene Marshall in the studio today. He is a philosophy professor at a state university in Florida, publishing books on early modern European philosophy. He is also one half of Arcanist Press, a tabletop role-playing game publisher creating content for D&D, Savage Worlds, and more, as well as a lead writer for Sigil Entertainment. With Sigil, he has put out Savage Sign 1, a Savage Worlds anthology, and several other titles. With Arcanist Press, he has had a successful Kickstarter and is putting out titles on DM's Guild and DriveThruRPG now. Welcome, Eugene, and thank you for being kind enough to join us for an interview to discuss your awesome new zine and system, Ancestry Culture, an alternative to race in 5e.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's great to talk to you guys.
So before we dig into the system, why don't we just start out with a basic question here, which is, how did you get involved in RPGs and what brought you to game design?
Well, I guess being a young geek in early 1980s is what got me involved in role-playing games. My parents bought me the red box. That's the basic D&D set, the Menser edition with the wonderful dragon on the cover. And I watched, I saw them play it in E.T. They didn't really play very accurately, but whatever. It was represented there. I watched the cartoon. I was into it. I played that in the 80s as well as some other games, and kept playing role-playing games with my friends in high school and even into college in the 90s. D&D, World of Darkness, all kinds of other fun games. Went to grad school, got married, had kids, drifted away from the gaming, as one does. And then in 5th edition, I came back. A friend of mine invited me to play on Roll20 about 5 or 6 years ago. 6 years ago now, wow. And I've been hooked ever since, playing constantly. 2 or 3 years ago, a guy I've been playing with invited me to contribute something to a book that he was publishing, because it ended up that he was a game publisher and an art director for Pinnacle Entertainment and a few other companies. This is Aaron Acevedo of Sigil Entertainment. And so I turned it in, and he liked it, and so I turned in more, and then more, and now I'm writing a lot of stuff for him. And recently I've decided to start putting out some of my stuff under my own name with my spouse, Amy, as Arcanist Press. And the first thing we decided to do was this Kickstarter that ended up being successful. So I was a DM for all my friends, because when I got back into D&D, I did so by getting the band back together, right? I invited my high school and college friends to play with me on Roll20, and the way I got them to do that was volunteering to run the game. So I ran them on a campaign level 1 through 20. It took 2 or 3 years, but
Wow.
I ended up creating a bunch of content for that just for fun, and I wanted to contribute back to the community because I've had such a wonderful time interacting with people and benefiting from the wonderful things that they've created. I've gone to conventions and met some of these great people, and I wanted to kind of be a part of that. So I thought, well, why not start sharing some of this online and through the marketplaces, and it's been great so far.
So, Eugene, I really love the system that you came up with, and we've been playing around with it a little bit. Can you tell us more about what it is and how you created it?
Sure. So it is an alternate character creation system for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition that replaces the race choice with ancestry and culture. So when you make a character, as I'm sure you guys know and have been doing in your channel, you start by choosing race, and then you move to class and background. So when you choose race, instead of choosing elf, dwarf, human, half-elf, in my system, you choose 2 things. You choose ancestry, which represents the biological heritage of your parents, or biological parents, and your culture, which represents the community in which you grew up and the kind of belief systems and practices you've adopted. This allows for example, an elf to be raised among dwarves And it allows for a mechanical difference so that you have the elven ancestral traits that might include dark vision and trance and Fey ancestry, whereas you get the dwarven cultural traditions like dwarven weapon training and the dwarven language. That felt more natural to me and allowed for a lot more flexibility and richness of character creation. That was the first step. And then the second step was to realize that you could also use those rules to create people of mixed ancestry. So somebody who has dwarven and elven ancestry, and then maybe grew up among gnomes, And so I created a pretty simple, straightforward system that allows you to just kind of create the characters you want to create. And that's basically what it is at heart.
I played around with it a little, just kind of off our channel, and I rolled a character with gnome ancestry who grew up in elf society and was a druid spy. I haven't thought through it any farther than that, but I thought that was a really fun one.
Yeah, it is. I like that.
What's interesting about this is, creating a new system like this, it suggests that there is something sort of not quite right about the previous system. So I'm curious, Eugene, kind of what your thoughts are about what has been wrong with race in a lot of fantasy role-playing games and D&D as well.
Sure. I mean, so the way I just described it suggested that one of its purposes, which is just to give players more rich, kind of diverse character options to create, right? But there was another reason, and in fact, a prior reason that led me to this, which is that the concept of race as used in D&D is problematic. And this was, I was inspired, this isn't my original idea by any means, by the work of some other people. The author N.K. Jemisin has a great essay about this. And then more recently, James Mendez Hodes and Graham Barber wrote several great blog posts about race in D&D and how problematic it is. Even more recently on D&D Beyond, Tristan Tarwater and Joey Hake wrote articles that talked about alternative ways to try to handle this problem. Now, what's the problem, you might ask? Well, it's that the way race works in D&D is that it assigns pretty central traits to people's biology. And those traits include intelligence, violence, evil, inherent goodness. And those are, as the authors I mentioned before point out really well, those are, when we talk that way in the real world, it's problematic. It's not just problematic, there's racial prejudice involved, right? If we say, well, this kind of person is naturally stronger and faster, and that kind of person's naturally smart, and that kind of person's naturally evil or violent, those are the ways that, well, lots of racial ideologies talk about people of different ancestries and from different parts of the world and with different phenotypes and whatnot. And so lots of people, myself included, aren't always comfortable employing what are obviously problematic ways of talking in the real world in our gaming world, right? I mean, after all, it is a little weird sometimes that we can just dismiss whole races of sentient individual creatures like orcs, say, in D&D as worthy of slaughter, adults and children all. But unless you're, it's an orc PC, which in the D&D 5th edition world, Volo's Guide to Monsters lets you do, you can play an orc. Oh, you're the good one, right? Well, we don't kill you. We just kill all the rest of them. It's unpleasantly reminiscent of real-world problems, real-world bad justifications. Now, I get that maybe not everyone is immediately bothered by this, and I'm not saying that people who want to do it the old-fashioned way are racists or something. I'm simply saying that it does bother a lot of people, and it's worth thinking about. It's worth everybody maybe thinking about. And if you decide that it does bother you or that you'd like to try an alternative, that's what my system is attempting to provide. Because when I divide up the traditional traits that you find in the player's handbook or the system reference document for, say, elf or human or dwarf, all the ones that could possibly be attributed to culture, I put in culture, which includes alignment. It includes ability score increases. It includes tendencies towards certain sorts of weapon use or battle tactics or anything. That way we're not putting inherent violence, inherent evil, inherent intelligence in people's biology, and we're instead explaining it as a part of culture. Now, of course, some people might say, well, you've just traded biological essentialism for cultural essentialism. And of course, that understandable, but so there are further changes. There are no, when in the version I've written of these, there aren't actually any strictly evil races at all or evil cultures. Instead, I change that language, and then I give an alternative set of rules at the end, which lets you remove alignment entirely, for example, and make even further changes if you want to remove all of the essentialism at all. But I wanted to keep at least some of the flavor in there because my ultimate goals are to, on the one hand, create a system that addresses this kind of problem, right? This kind of issue that is really racial essentialism, and it's unpleasant in the real world, and so a lot of people don't want to encounter it in their game worlds. But I also wanted to do it in a way that still was recognizably Dungeons and Dragons, right? So it's like elves are still elven and dwarves are still dwarven, and if you're an elf, if you're of elf ancestry and you grew up in elven culture, you're just a D&D elf, right? In all the normal ways. It's just that if you grew up in dwarven culture or something else, then you might look a little different, etc. So those are the basic changes. And like I said, I did alter, for example, the orc culture so that they're not inherently violent, evil people, either biologically or culturally. But otherwise, the system's supposed to be pretty familiar and easy to pick up and use by your average D&D player. So that's the kind of raison d'etre, if you will, for the project.
So what would you say to those folks out there who talk about D&D being a fantasy world and, it doesn't have any, the real world doesn't have any bearing, real world sort of racial ideas don't have any bearing in this fantasy world? Like, what do you say to those folks who would disagree with you on that point?
Sure. So, yeah, I've had those conversations, and I reckon, people will say, well, these aren't races, they're species or something like this, as though that somehow removes the problem. I don't think it does. I'll remind them two things. Number one, I will remind them that I'm not saying that everyone who just wants to use the player's handbook as written is immoral or something. I'm saying that some people don't like that for decent reasons, and this is an alternative for those people. If you aren't one of those people, then don't use this alternative if you don't want. On the other hand, there's that second reason, which is even if you don't think that biological essentialism in your fantasy gaming is problematic, it still allows you to make much richer and more interesting characters. So that alone, I hope, would be a decent motivator. So that's the first thing I'd say. It's like, well, if you're not interested in the reasons that this has been created, then that's fine. It's optional. On the other hand, though, I will push back a little bit on the premise, which is that I don't think that the fantasy world is really that easily detached from the quote-unquote real world. I myself, at least, there are things that, were they to occur in my fantasy worlds, even though they're fictional characters, would still bother me. I mean, if I'm watching a movie and I'm enjoying and I'm becoming emotionally attached to the characters, or a video game and I'm being asked to do something in order to advance the plot, there are things that I'm not going to be comfortable witnessing or doing in my game. Same thing with a role-playing game. If the game is predicated on genocide or violence against children or, misogyny, that's not fun for me. And I think a lot of people don't find that fun either. So the issue with the race issue is that I think just a lot of people don't recognize that that's what's happening in the game when they're playing it. And so I'm hoping by just drawing people's attention to, hey, did you notice that these are the same tropes, stereotypes, justifications that people use in the real world for racism, and we're now using it in D&D to just slaughter orc children or something. Hey, how do you feel about that? I think a lot of people, just when you draw their attention to it, will say, oh yeah, that's kind of gross, and they won't want to do it as much. I certainly, once my eyes were opened by some of the people I mentioned before, it kind of lost its charm a little bit. I don't think I've ever done this, but I certainly have been a player in a game where, okay, you defeated the orcs and you go into their cave and there are orc babies. What do you do? Like, no. I don't want to do that or go there. And I think when people realize that sort of thing, hey, that's the same kind of thing that hateful ideologies have used in history to justify the slaughter of people that are other than them. You think, oh, do I want to play act that? Like, I don't like to play act racism, right? That's not fun. So it's true that, hey, it's not real, but it's just like I wouldn't like my kids play acting genocide and racism, because why would I want to do those things? How is that fun? How does that fun for other people at the table? Right? Especially if you're playing with people you don't know what's going to bother them, right? Or I just don't think it's a good mental habit to be in, let's say, to practice those sorts of things.
One of the best pieces of advice I got, I think, from a YouTube channel when I was first DMing was to do a session 0, and in that session, not just talk about like how the game's going to go and logistics, but also kind of bring up any issues that might be problematic for people, because you don't necessarily know what might trigger somebody or upset somebody. And so I think in the game that I started with Christian, I think we did that over a chat maybe, but I remember there were certain things that we said, we probably should stay away from these areas. So I would like to actually maybe switch gears a little bit. I mean, I think that I'm really intrigued by kind of the idea of how much this system opens up the possibilities for role playing, and also the fact that you've been kind of writing these adventures and they're connected. I'd love to hear maybe some examples of some of the types of like really interesting characters that have come out of this, and then maybe you could also talk a little bit about the adventures that you've created.
Sure. Oh, that'd be fun. So one of the things I've enjoyed doing with this system is creating characters that, well, I mean, it's kind of a standard, I guess, for when I create adventures. I like to kind of subvert tropes a little bit. So in one of the adventures I wrote, Helping Hands, the party encounters an orc village, and they've been tasked with going to this orc village to accomplish something. But when they arrive, that's how it was kind of represented. But when they arrive, they find that it's actually multicultural. So there's orcs and halflings and humans and elves living together. It's just predominantly orc, right? But their culture is actually something more like halfling culture, traditionally represented. So they're like agrarian, and they like when you show up, they invite you in for food and that sort of thing, right? So it allows me to imagine what would it be like if orcs were people too, and they lived in a kind of agrarian community. What would it be like to, think of them as just like any other fantasy race? So one thing that's been fun is mixing and matching, the traditional violent orc, but in a halfling culture. What does that look like? And also representing those quote unquote orc cultures, which are again normally presented as like bloodthirsty, violent murderers. Like, what would it be? How can we reclaim orc identity, in a way that isn't so simplistic and kind of Tolkien-esque? And unfortunately, in this sense, I mean that in a bad way. I love, whatever. I grew up on Tolkien, reading it again and again. But orcs are kind of a stand-in for the evil other in a lot of ways in his books. And, it would be, well, maybe they're not that bad, or they don't have to be, at least in your games. There's plenty of evil monsters and, just evil people. They don't have to be evil races or ancestries, right? There can be an evil orc, but he's not evil just because he's an orc. That's too simple. So being able to create characters where you mix and match really allows you to explore that.
I also really like, one of the things that's really cool, and which we experienced when we did our episode 6, is that, when you place somebody with one ancestry into a different cultural background, it really does make you see that person in a different light. And so I love this idea, like if you have an orc ancestry and that elf cultural background, then it's like, oh, I have to really actually think about this orc as a person rather than whatever sort of things that I'm carrying from Tolkien or whatever. And so that's like, it just immediately does it. It's really a cool thing.
Yeah, and I really look forward to the opportunity to play and see, like, there's an orc who grew up among elves meeting an orc who grew up among orcs, and then there's one that grew up among dwarves, and like having them interact in the way that, it reminds me very much of real world interactions where you meet somebody of one kind of ancestry or ethnic background, but they grew up in America versus somebody who grew up in a different country, and how they have some things in common, but other things not, and you can see that they're just individuals. You can't just use one kind of blanket term for all of these people.
Yeah, I'm playing a character in a game that my cousin is running where it's a gnome who grew up in a dwarven society because her parents were really amazing engineers. And so the dwarves hired her parents, and she was just raised there, and she became a cleric of Moradin, the dwarven god.
I think the pre-gens are in the document I sent you, the draft. And there is a gnome who was raised among dwarves because her father was a master smith. And she became a cleric of the forge.
No way! Are you serious?
I'm serious.
I don't remember seeing that, but oh my god.
I'm pretty sure it's in that document. If it isn't, I can send it to you because it's,
No, yeah.
hey, what do you know? Think great minds and all that.
That is so good. You're tackling the issue of racial essentialism in D&D. I'm wondering if there are other areas that you would want to see sort of improved on, expanded on, sort of worked with in D&D or other sort of fantasy role-playing.
Sure. I mean, so the reason that the kind of actual reason I did the topic of race is because I was encountering a lot of smart people who were pointing out the problem. But more is that race has a mechanical role in D&D, right? So it gives you attributes and features and traits. Other elements of, say, identity, say like sexuality, gender identity, ability, those are features that are represented in the art, let's say, and in the stories. So if you read a lot of Wizards of the Coast's recent adventures, they often have gay characters, non-binary characters, disabled characters represented, and there's no mechanical effect. It's all narrative effect, and that's great, and I welcome that. And I'd like to see more of that. But because there isn't a mechanical, there used to be in old D&D, right? If you played a woman character,
Right.
sometimes there would be different rules for you. You'd have different level caps in AD&D, and there's the optional embarrassment, optional comeliness stat in the 80s. It was in Dragon Magazine, I believe. So, right. So, if the names for your classes were different, if you were a man versus a woman, thief, for example. Anyway, we got rid of that, fortunately. So there's not a lot of mechanical work to be done on those fronts, but I'd certainly, at least in D&D, but I'd certainly like to see even more representation in the art, in the stories, etc. But I try to do what I can in that in my stories and in the art I commission. I ask specifically for not just ancestral or racial, but gender and sexual and ability diversity. So that's one place I can do some of that work. But I think that the place where I would like to work next, or where I think there's a lot of room to work, where people haven't done a lot, is more in social representations. So I think that a lot of stories we still see are set in, traditional medieval monarchies, or and it's just the monarch versus the kind of like horde. And so it would be neat to see more ways of living, right? Like, you don't see a lot of democracies in D&D fantasy worlds. You don't see a lot of communal living. Like, what would a collective that doesn't have private property look like in a fantasy world on a big scale? Like a nation or a continent or something. Things like that would be kind of neat. I think there's lots of room for. I mean, there is a volume in the Dungeon Masters Guild that recently came out titled "Eat the Rich," which is an anti-capitalist collection of adventures. And so I think that's interesting. Right? That's a place where work could be done, or where things could be questioned and challenged. So those are a few. I'd like to see more adventures that are focused on positivity, that are a little bit more about, and I'm trying to do this in the adventures I'm writing, that are more about, how to put it, I don't know. I'm a little tired in this day and age of grim, dark stories. And so having stories that I can come away feeling uplifted by and fed emotionally by that's an important thing for me personally, but I think that can be a political act too, So I'd like to see some of that.
I think a lot about like sort of patriarchal versus matriarchal societies
Yeah.
in games. And those I think do come up in D&D a bit more than some of the other stuff you mentioned. But yeah, I think the tendency when someone creates a world, it's that because we live in a patriarchal society, the world just kind of reflects that automatically, and we don't really question that. So it's great to just kind of pull back and think about those things.
Absolutely. And one thing I'd like to point out as well is I'm not a fan of people who say, well, that's what it was like in the Middle Ages or something, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, well, I mean, this is a world with magic and dragons, and the one way you want to be realistic is in like the ways in which the real world was really lousy. Like that makes no sense, right? So if you're going to be realistic, you shouldn't be playing Dungeons and Dragons, right? That's not what we're doing here. We're having fun telling fantasy stories. We don't have to force racism and sexism into our games because they exist in the real world. Like, are you also, like go look at D&D maps and tell me how many toilets you see. Those castles don't have toilets. All those beautiful maps, don't have bathrooms.
Yeah, I remember this argument, when Game of Thrones was extremely popular and there was all this horrible sort of treatment of women and sexual violence. And people were all like, well, that's what it was like. And we were like, when? When we had dragons? When winter was coming in an upside down version of Great Britain? I also really like, a lot of the fantasy literature over the past decade or so is really allowing for exploration of other ideas, whether it's the Prior of the Orange Tree or if it's the Stormlight Archive, where, the orcs in that series are not orcs, they're people with culture, and they're people who have thoughts and feelings and, desires and intentions. And just seeing all that, really, it seems like over the past decade, maybe decade and a half, and we're getting fantasy worlds depicted in fiction that I gotta believe will also start filtering further into what we're doing here in role-playing.
So what is next, Eugene? Do you have any new projects coming out? And also kind of where are you pulling inspiration from these days?
So I have so many projects. I have too many projects. So I'm finishing the Kickstarter. It's almost done, fulfilling that. I have a collection of class options called Subclasses of the Planes, which will come out on DM's Guild in a month or two. I have a title just out now on DM's Guild about its warlock patrons of law and chaos. I have an adventure called The Shape of Madness, which is a Modron base oriented adventure with some surprises.
Yes!
That is it's also a little bit of my homage to like the old bonkers Death Trap dungeons like Caves of Chaos or White Plume Mountain or something. So it's some of these old kind of weird mind-bending trap sorts of adventures. So that's one I'm putting out soon that I'm really excited about. Those are small-ish projects. I've got some bigger projects in that my friend Aaron at Sigil Entertainment is putting out Savage Sign 2 in a couple months, and that has a setting of mine that is a combination of Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and H.P. Lovecraft. So it's like, imagine if Captain Nemo discovered the lost city, like Cthulhu sleeping or something at the bottom of the ocean, and what happens then, that sort of thing. And beyond that, I've got one or two other big projects, like a superhero system that is based on the 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons rules. Nice. So there's a D&D-based system called Espergenesis, which is out right now. It's been out for a year or two from Alligator Alley Entertainment. They're great. It is a science fiction kind of version of 5th edition. So I said, hey, look, they took the 5th edition system and they put it in a different genre. And I wonder if I could do that, but with superheroes. And so I sat down and thought hard about it and came up with a way for it to work. And so that's been written, but it's going to be a while before art, layout, editing. It might be 6 months or a year even before that sees the light of day. Honestly, it would come out sooner, but things as they are, the economy is kind of up in the air, so we don't know when would be best to kickstart that. Last thing I'll mention, because I could keep going, but I'll stop after this one, is I produced a setting in the Savage Sign 1, which is based on the French Revolution, called Revolution. And so I have a 5th edition version I've made that eventually will come out as well. So that's very historical. So that's very historically kind of, I don't want to say accurate exactly, but I did a lot of research. My day job is 17th and 18th century European philosophy, so I know a little bit about all that stuff. So it's like you only play humans, and there's like interactions with like real historical people. Like you can bump into whatever, Napoleon or the King Louis the 16th or whatever, these sorts of things. And it's, one of the adventures is, like springing the Marquis de Sade from the Bastille, that sort of thing, right? It's like just having fun in a historical space with all of these great resources that are real history. So that's a thing I'm doing too. Now, where am I getting inspiration for all that? Oh, a couple places. One, I am an avid consumer of genre fiction and film, right? So I'm reading. My favorites recently are the aforementioned N.K. Jemisin. I really like Pat Rothfuss lately.
I just read the first 2 of the King Killer. I'm sorry to interrupt. It just gets into a weird place in book 2 where he's just sexing up everybody. It's like, come on.
Honestly, there's some stuff I'm not a huge fan of with the gender representation in this book.
Yeah.
I'll agree with that. But so also TV, I watch everything that's fantasy TV related, so I watch with my kids, I've really been enjoying The Dragon Prince.
Yes, so good.
She-Ra, Princesses of Power, this kind of stuff. I could go on and on. The new Dark Crystal was wonderful, and things like that. So anyway, so that's those places, right? And also just I play games with a lot of people, and I try to play different systems and with different kinds of games. And so seeing, for example, oh, wow, over here in this other game system, they have rules and methods and mechanics for representing the full range of human emotion and relationships and stuff. And it's harder to do that in D&D. So how could I, it's just noticing a lack or a place where I have a friction point when I'm playing. And I think, well, what could I do to change that? Or I have a really wonderful experience playing a game. It's like, oh, I really loved this part, the way I felt in this part of the game. And then I think, what would it take for me to recreate that for other people? Because I'm that kind of person that it's like, if I eat something I like, I'm like, here, everybody, come here and taste this. Everyone, I need to share this, right? And listen to this song. I'm that sort of person. And so I love gaming and have so much fun. And it's really been like cathartic to not just have these experiences role-playing, but connecting with people through it and over it. And I just want to kind of share that. I want to have other people have that experience, And so I bring that to my game design. I think like, well, what can I do when I'm writing this story to make people have that moment of wonder or surprise or delight, Because that's what feeds me, and I like to return the favor, so to speak.
So where can people find your stuff, Eugene? Because, of course, we'll have it in the description below. But, tell them where to go.
Right. So arcanistpress.com, that's ARCANIST, is the big overview and the product page. Arcanist Press on Twitter. I update regularly as well. There's an Instagram that gets everything visual gets posted there. You can check the Kickstarter out. It's already finished. Ancestry and Culture, an alternative to race in 5e, but there's public updates regularly, and there will eventually be all of those products, the zine, the custom races or ancestries and whatnot, all will go on Drive-Thru-RPG eventually. So you might want to check that out. I think those are probably the best places to find me.
Okay, well, thank you so much for talking to us, Eugene, and also for just developing such a cool and important system. And then, folks watching, you can tune into us putting Ancestry and Culture into action in episode 6 of Let's Roll Characters right now.
And as always, please like and subscribe, leave us comments, let us know what you think of this interlude.
Yeah, and thanks for watching.
Now go play some D&D.
Boom, 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 boom. Characters, gonna roll characters. It feels so corny asking somebody to say that.
I know.
I am down with saying that.
It's so corny asking somebody
It's genuine.
to say
I hope
that.
people do go play some D&D.